Welcome to World at Work TV. I'm Allison Avalos, and I'm joined today by Carrie Hsu to talk about incentive pay practices. World at Work recently conducted a survey with Deloitte Consulting and Vivient Consulting to examine the incentive pay practices at both publicly traded organizations as well as those who are non-publicly traded. Carrie, for context, will you start off by explaining the difference between short and long-term incentives for us?
Yeah, sure. Allison, the difference between long-term and short-term incentives really just comes down to a measurement period of time. And that measurement period divider line is typically 1 year.
And I know World at Work tends to distinguish between incentive and bonus programs based on the discretionary nature that typically comes with bonus programs. But for purposes of this survey, bonuses were looked at as well, correct?
From our viewpoint, bonuses are a little bit different than incentives in the way that bonuses are really looking at a specific payout for a specific goal, okay? So if I hire you and you join the company, I will give you X dollars. And if you do that, you get the X dollars. If you don't, you get nothing. So a bonus is kind of a very specific goal, and you get all or nothing. Incentives, on the other hand, are usually plans where goals are set in advance. And then the organization has to, of course, have a measurement period and see how they do. And they might do really well, they might do kind of what we thought, and they might do very poorly. And depending on how they perform, the organization either will have no payout at all, or they might have a payout that we would call it kind of at target, or what we expected, or it could be at the maximum, which could be 150, 200, or 250%. So there are some specific differences. However, the commonality is for both of those things, because the goal and the payout are made typically within that 1 year period, we put them together in short-term incentives.
So we took a sector approach to this research, which is the first time we've done something like this. And this was actually the third time that we gathered data on non-publicly traded organizations, but the first time we gathered data on publicly traded organizations in the US. When it comes to short-term incentives, what are the similarities and differences across the sectors?
Well, interestingly, we see some similarities and some differences. For example, in annual incentive plans, these are the profit sharing, the goal sharing kinds of plans that you see in many companies. Nearly 85 to 90% of both public and private companies have these kinds of plans, so very common. For nonprofit companies, it's less common, but it's still out there. About 75 to 76, or 3/4 of organizations have those plans. And so while we see just a little bit of drop-off, most organizations, whether they're private, public, or not-for-profit, have these plans. If we look at another example, let's look at discretionary bonus plans, for example. We see quite a bit of a drop-off amongst all three of the sectors, really in the upper 30s to upper 40% range for prevalence for those organizations, with really private organizations having the greatest prevalence at about 47%, but still less than annual incentive plans. Another example would be spot awards. Now, interestingly, spot awards are very prevalent in public companies or publicly traded companies. So 65% of organizations have spot award programs where someone just says, hey, you did a great job, I'm going to give you $100 or $1,000 for that. So very spontaneous type of award. When we get to private and nonprofit, it drops off quite a bit. We're only looking in the 40% range for prevalence amongst those. So while we don't have any specific data on why the difference there, I think one speculation might be that for publicly traded companies, we have a little bit more competition in terms of retaining employees. For private and nonprofit organizations, I think there's lifestyle, there's kind of ability to be more flexible in your work that might tailor you to desire to work more at those companies. But for the publicly traded companies, I think they might have to do a little bit more in the cash compensation area, and that's why you might see things like spot bonuses being a little bit higher.
In order to determine who's deserving of these awards, there's usually some sort of measurements being used. When we look at the measurements between the sectors, What do you see there in terms of the numbers of measures that are used and the types of measures that are used for short-term incentives?
Well, first of all, for the number of measures, what we see is for the public and private organizations, the most prevalent number of measures that they're going to use. Let's pick an annual incentive plan, for example. The most prevalent number we would see is between 1 and 3 goals. For nonprofit organizations, that actually goes up a little bit. It's 4 to 6 goals is the most prevalent. And in fact, when we look at nonprofits, 20% of those organizations have 7 or more goals in their plan. So, you know, one thing we can look at is kind of what's going on here. And I think for public and private organizations that might be a little bit larger, and many of those organizations, of course, have constituents. They have shareholders, or they have an owner or a small set of owners who are running the organization. Of course, shareholders are going to have financial objectives in mind, stock price appreciation, earnings per share. And so organizations, the management teams have to answer to those. And for that reason, we're going to see perhaps fewer numbers of goals for the larger private and public organizations because they're focusing more on the financial metrics. In terms of what kind of metrics, to your second question, of course we see financial metrics. Those are the most common. We see operational metrics, improving efficiency, improving productivity, getting our products to our customers faster. And finally, we're looking at customer satisfaction. Are our customers satisfied? Now, in that way, we're more likely to see, again, financial objectives being more of one of the top goals or carrying much more of a weight for the public and private organizations, while nonprofit organizations, you're more likely to see the goals kind of spread out, and in fact, you're most likely to see customer satisfaction having a significant weight in those goals. So it's very interesting when you look at it by sector. You do see similarities, but differences also.
If we shift to a look at the long-term incentive data, there are some expected differences between the sectors just based on pure definition of long-term incentives, correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. What we see is, of course, for public organizations that have stock that's available for sale on the market, long-term incentives, particularly restricted stock and stock options, are extremely common. 85, again, 90% of organizations have those. When we look to private organizations, that number is going to drop off. We're looking at 55 to 60% of those organizations having some kind of long-term vehicle. And then when we get to government nonprofit, of course, it drops off precipitously. Only about 16% of organizations have a long-term plan. I would just note that you don't necessarily have to have publicly traded stock in your organization to have a long-term plan. There are many cash plans that are multi-year in terms of goals, accomplishment, and payouts. There's phantom stock, there's stock appreciation. And so just by virtue of having or not having stock does not mean that you can't have a long-term plan. But notwithstanding, we don't see a huge prevalence in the nonprofit and government sector.
Are there any results in this survey that are surprising to you?
From the private survey that we've been able to do now for the past 3 years, we have seen a fairly significant increase in the use of short-term incentives. I think when we did it back in 2007, when we took that survey, only about 35% of private companies were using short-term incentives. And now that statistic is much higher. We're in the 70–80% range, so that has gone up quite a bit. The use of long-term incentives, interestingly, has grown also, but has kind of peaked and it actually dropped a little bit between the 2011 survey and the current survey that we're doing now. The short answer is, if anyone has any fear that short or long-term incentives are going away, there's no indication of that. Over the years, it has become a critical part of the total compensation, and all indications are that it will continue to do so.
So I hear your prediction on that, which was going to be my final question. And if you look forward to the next 3 to 5 years, I realize there are a lot of financial aspects that are fairly unpredictable, but in terms of the long-term trend, you see these programs continuing in most organizations.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the major advantages to both short-term and long-term incentives, if we sort of set those aside and think about base pay for a second, base pay is sort of that day in and day out, year in and year out, that is going to be more or less a fixed expense that an organization has. And with the financial crisis, with the recession, with the the uncertainty, kind of the bipolar nature of the stock market, it's up, it's down. People just aren't quite sure what is going to happen. The recovery continues to be nervous, I think, in part because of that. And so variable pay, whether it's short-term incentives or long-term incentives, plays a unique and valuable role in that you can adjust upwards or downwards based on your organization's performance, the amount that's paid out. So in that way, short-term, long-term incentives are advantageous to base pay alone, which is why most organizations use a combination.
Thank you, Carrie. For World at Work TV, I'm Allison Avalos.